Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susie Golding, the founder of COVID Long Hauler Support Group Canada. And today I have the pleasure and honor to speak with world-renowned neuroscientist, Dr. Adrian Owen. You may know Dr. Owen, who is spearheading the massive CanCove brain study, which explores the impacts of COVID on the brain, partnered with the Sunnybrook Hospital. So I'm going to let Dr. Owen take it away from here. And Dr. Owen, could you give us a brief background of how it got you to this point?
Of course, yeah. Well, thanks for your interest. Thanks for talking to me. So I am a neuroscientist. I'm a professor of neuroscience and imaging at the University of Western Ontario here in London, Canada. And my background is really in assessing brain function after brain injury. So typically in non-COVID times, what I do is I see patients who've had serious brain injuries. That's either traumatic brain injuries because they've perhaps been in a road traffic accident or they've been hit on the head with something, or non-traumatic brain injuries, patients who've had stroke or who've suffered from loss of oxygen to the brain through something like a cardiac arrest. And I assess or I try and develop methods to improve the diagnosis and the prognosis. That's can we improve how well we can predict who's going to recover and who isn't. Now, of course, the pandemic hit. For me, it was really early March of this year that it became very difficult for us to go into the ICUs in the hospitals around here to see patients. And we had to look at other things that we could do, other things that we could contribute scientifically. And COVID-19 is an interesting virus because very early on it became obvious that it was having an effects on the brain. I think we still don't know whether the effects are direct, whether it's actually affecting brain function, or whether it's indirect, whether it's affecting things like respiration that affect how oxygen gets to the brain. So it's sort of an indirect effect on the brain. But there's no question, I think, that people are reporting all sorts of mid and long-term cognitive and neurological deficits. One of the things that I do is that I run a website called cambridgebrainsciences.com that has a number of simple tests or games on the site to allow people to test their cognition. And by that I mean things like memory and concentration and their ability to solve simple problems. To date, 10 million people have used the website. That's prior to the pandemic. So when things really started to take off, we thought, well, this is an excellent opportunity to try and follow the trajectory of as many COVID-19 survivors as we possibly can. So since about early June, we've been encouraging anybody who has either been formally diagnosed through a test that they are COVID-19 positive, or who has been advised by a medical professional that they probably have COVID-19, to log in to the study. It's the website, we developed a specific website. It's called covidbrainstudy.com. You log in there, it's completely anonymous, and what we're doing is we are following people. So this gives you two things. It'll tell us things like, who is having these cognitive problems? How long are they lasting? Are people recovering? Is everybody affected in the same way? Is it related to how bad the virus affected you? Things like that. For the people who participate, it's a good way of them monitoring their cognitive and neurological function. So it will tell you whether you actually have problems, because for many of us, I'm a 54-year-old guy. My memory is not as sharp as it used to be. Sometimes, I worry a little bit about that. But actually, when I compare myself to the rest of the population of 54-year-old guys like me, I find that actually my memory is pretty average. And this is important because many of us have the sense as we get older that various aspects of our mental or cognitive functioning are not as good as they used to be. And that might be true, but it may have nothing to do with something like COVID-19. And so it's really important that I think people check their own mental health, check your own cognitive status, test your memory, test your concentration. It takes 10 minutes, it's a lot of fun, but it'll tell you how you match up with the rest of the population of people like you. And I think that for some people can be quite reassuring. But for us, it tells us a lot about COVID-19 and where we're going to be a year from now. Is this going to be a huge societal and economic problem that we need to find solutions to right now, or are these transient issues that are going to go away with time? We really don't know right now, but we're making good headway. We're following about 3,000. We have about 3,000 volunteers, participants enrolled in the study so far.
Excellent. Well, you're doing a lot of work, and we thank you very much for jumping in and helping us and speaking to us today. We do have a lot of questions for you.
Go ahead.
A lot of things like brain fog and tinnitus, and a lot of issues that people are wondering, can we get any help with, and you have any suggestions, or what exactly is going on, and how much do you know so far? So I guess that would lead into our first question, just to very generalize, what is brain fog? What is causing brain fog?
So that's it. I mean, that's the $100 million question, really. We really don't know. We know it's a thing because many people describe that they are having this problem. They say, that they're having brain fog. Other patients I see say things like, well, I'm just not back to my usual self. I just can't concentrate the way I used to. And the truth is, brain fog is not it's not yet an official medical diagnosis. That doesn't mean we don't think it happens. We know people are getting it, but we don't know specifically what it is. Is it a problem of attention? Is it a problem of memory? Is it a problem of problem solving? And all of these things are functions of the brain that we as neuroscientists know quite a lot about. So we have to find a way of translating an expression like brain fog into what we actually do know about the brain. Is this an issue that's affecting some parts of the brain and not others? Is it affecting some aspects of cognition and not others? We honestly don't know. We're 100% sure it's happening, it's there, but one of the main aims of this project is to try and define exactly what brain fog is.
Now, I was reading in one article that a brain fog could possibly have been caused by lack of oxygen to the brain at some point. Could this be in part what is going on with some of those people?
Yeah, I mean, that's extremely likely. In many ways, that's the most likely explanation. Outside of pandemic times, as I've said, I work very often with patients who've had what we call an anoxic brain injury. They've had a loss of oxygen to the brain. Now, that could be because that's happened in the course of a cardiac arrest. I've seen patients who've been buried under avalanches and have not had oxygen for a prolonged period of time. Near drowning incidents. All of these things are ways in which the brain is starved of oxygen, and they cause catastrophic brain injuries. Really, really, quite terrible problems that sometimes people never recover from. What we have here is a situation that's quite likely a mild version of that. We have a respiratory illness. We have something that is affecting respiration. It is affecting how much oxygen gets to your brain and when, and that can have mild effects on cognitive function. Also, many patients watching this may have had very severe COVID-19, may have been hospitalized, may have even ended up in the ICU on a ventilator. Now there you have a clear mechanism for interfering, if you like, with the flow of oxygen to the brain. So there are many ways in which this is a possibility, and the only way we're really going to pull this apart is if we compare different patients who've, for example, been ventilated versus those who haven't, or patients who've had worse respiratory symptoms versus patients who've had relatively mild symptoms. I think that's the only way we're really going to unpack the truth.
So a lot of us are having imaging done and getting testing and finding that none of these issues are showing up on any of the MRIs or the diagnostics. So what kind of testing can we have done to show that there is, in fact, cognitive impairment?
That's a great question, and it's one I've been, I'm asked many times. And my background is in brain imaging, so I know a lot about that, but also in cognitive assessment. And the answer to your question is, you've got to test with what you know. If it's what is brain fog, we're asking, then cognitive testing is the answer to that. I'm not saying imaging has no role to play here, but there are many diseases of the brain or problems affecting the brain that don't show very much on imaging at all. I mean, take conditions like depression and schizophrenia. I mean, if you put these people with those conditions into a brain scanner, you won't really see any differences in their brain, and that's because the problem is in the functioning of the brain rather than in the structure. It's not really in what you see when you do a brain scan, it's in how the brain is performing, how it's functioning. So the answer to your question is to get good cognitive testing. Right now it's very difficult. I know that there are long lines for people to get assessed properly, and as I say, people can go to covidbrainstudy.com and test themselves there, and that will give you a very fast and reliable answer to whether you actually do have problems or not. I really do encourage people to do that. It's free, it's anonymous, you don't have to give us any of your medical details, but we will tell you how well or how badly affected your cognitive function is, and perhaps we'll tell you a little bit about what your brain fog might be too.
A couple of us have done some testing locally in our area, and I did get my results, and I was actually astonished. I got in a couple of aspects, 5 out of 100, a 9 out of 100, 9, 8, 37. There were a few very low scores that I was actually quite surprised.
Were these on cognitive tests?
On cognitive tests.
Well,
yes.
so yeah, now that it doesn't surprise me at all, because one of the amazing things about our cognitive function is that we can often compensate. Many of us can compensate, and even in the face of really quite serious deficits, sometimes they can be quite difficult to pin down unless you formally test them, because we find other ways to do things, other ways to think about things, and in a way it doesn't surprise me that you were surprised, and I think other people might also be surprised when they test their own cognitive function, that they may be rather more impaired than they even think.
Yes. Okay, now another question. A lot of people are finding that physical, mental, and emotional output can throw our bodies into a state of relapse. How important is it to know our limits and work within them? Are brain breaks useful?
I think that's an interesting question, and it gets back to what is brain fog, and the answer is, not only do we not really understand what brain fog is, we don't really understand how to mitigate against it. We don't know what what therapies, what interventions, whether breaks will do any good. But I always say, whenever we start a scientific journey looking into trying to understand a disease, the first thing that we always do is, before we can even think about therapies or interventions, we have to fully understand the problem. Think about it, if you're trying to fix a car that didn't drive, unless you can completely understand why that car is not moving, you can't begin to fix the problem. It's exactly the same with the brain, and particularly with any new brain disorder like COVID-19. So, we really have to fully understand what the problem is before we can put steps into place to fix the problem. I would never discourage anybody from taking brain breaks. I think in general it's always a good idea to walk away and relax for a while. But right now we don't know whether it's going to have any beneficial effects for the cognitive deficits that we see in COVID-19.
I just found myself that in June I started having a lot of neurological issues myself, and they really came on like a wall, like hitting a wall, and I had a lot of feelings of having a concussion. It was almost as if I was concussed in a state, and I found that if I closed my eyes, it would help. I really had to take some brain breaks, so that's why we were asking about. And physical exertion seems to just cause a relapse, and not just with the neurological issues, but like in the body in general. They were wondering if taking it easy was the way to go.
Well, that's very interesting that you compare it to concussion, because I've heard this many times over the last few months, that many people who have experienced both the effects of COVID-19 and a concussion say that there are similarities. And this is why cognitive testing is so important, and it's so important that people, if they can spare the time, help us with this research, because, for example, last year we did almost exactly the same thing with concussion. We did a Canada-wide, in fact it was a worldwide, but most of our participants came from Canada, look at concussion, because it has these similarities. People describe concussion, they've had a concussion, they say, I'm not back to, something's not right, I've got brain fog, I'm not like I used to be. But we really don't understand, or we didn't understand exactly what that is. So we set up a website very similar to the COVID brain study website, and we had 5,000 people who'd been concussed log in and do these cognitive tests. And we were able to identify exactly what the problem was in concussion. The fact that it's not a generalized cognitive deficit, it was actually something really quite specific. Very profound, and it certainly has a big effect on people's lives, but we could quite precisely define what it was cognitively, and therefore what part of the brain was most likely to be involved. And that's what we'd really like to try and do with COVID-19. We'd like to try and get to that same place.
Right, okay. This question is about dysautonomia. Can't even pronounce it. Dysautonomia. A lot of people are having issues and being diagnosed with POTS. We have the symptoms, and can you explain what how this could be affecting the nervous system?
Well, it's rather the same as the answer given previously, I'm sorry to say, which is that right now we don't know the answers to that. This is a virus. A virus can affect every organ of the body, so it could be affecting the brain directly. But in order for it to affect the brain directly, it has to cross what is known as the blood-brain barrier. And right now, I'm going to say the jury's out, but I think we are moving in the direction of understanding that is what's happening. There are direct viral effects on the brain. But regardless of that, there are many other parts of the body, many other parts of the nervous system that might be vulnerable to the effects of the virus. To be honest, this is outside of my area of expertise. I'm interested in what's going on in the brain, and can we work out what's happening there. But many people are working, on exactly this problem, trying to find out which parts of the body are getting affected by the virus, and if possible, can we take steps to mitigate those effects.
We're wondering about people experiencing inner body vibrations and shaking tremors. Could these be stemming from the brain injury as well?
They certainly could, and again, this is sort of part of the problem. That if you add up all the symptoms that have been reported by everybody, it becomes an extremely complex problem. And in a way, that's what we are trying to solve, and that's why it's important that we get as many people to sign up as we can, because some of those things will be sort of key or core aspects of the brain effects of COVID-19. Some of them will be coincidental. When you have a virus like this that's affected, I've lost count, 30 million or so people worldwide, you're going to have some core or some problems, deficits that most people get, and those are the things that are most likely to be related to the virus itself. And then you're going to get an awful lot of other things going on as well, that some of them would have gone on anyway, whether or not the person would have had the virus. Some of them may be completely unrelated to the virus, maybe related to other types of problems, other types of brain diseases. And the only way scientists like me can unpack these things and give the public answers is if we test a lot of people. Because if I test one person, I'm going to have a list of her problems, a list of the difficulties and the challenges she's been faced with, and I'm not going to know which of those she would have had anyway, which of those are related to the virus, which of those may be related to some other problem. We really have to get a lot of people, and by a lot I mean thousands. Ideally we want every single COVID-19 positive person in Canada to sign up to this study, because it's only then that we'll be able to pull apart, what's really going on here and what are the consequences that are truly related to COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. A lot of us are wondering about dizziness. Along with the brain fog, seems to go hand in hand, dizziness, with some other symptoms. So neurologists, I saw a neurologist, and the neurologist thought perhaps it was an inner ear. When I went to the ENT, they thought perhaps it was I need to see a neurologist. So is there any understanding at all why we could be suffering from dizziness? And is there any way that we can try and resolve some of these symptoms?
Again, I think this is, this is going to be a very frustrating answer, but it's still early days as far as understanding this virus. This is a virus that, as far as we know, didn't really exist at the beginning of this year, and it's escalated to the point that a large proportion of the world's population are now infected. And, that's happened very, very quickly, and we don't understand about some of the neurological symptoms, some of the cognitive symptoms, and how they might be related to either direct or indirect effects of the virus on the brain. And all I can say is, I promise you that there are hundreds of us, probably thousands of us, working on exactly this problem, trying to work out what are the core symptoms. Is dizziness one of them? Headaches. A lot of people are complaining of headaches. Fatigue. It's another potentially neurological problem that a lot of people are complaining of. But why are some people getting these and not everybody? Why is it not that everybody is having dizziness? And those are the sorts of questions we really need to get to the bottom of, because that's the only way we can begin to help people.
Thank you. Could you explain why one feels anxious when the lungs aren't properly working? Is it a signs that the brain is sending out to the body that cause anxiety, that we're not getting the oxygen? How does that happen?
So, I think a lot of people are very anxious right now. Yeah, people who have been diagnosed positively with COVID-19, I think, have reasons to be more anxious than those of us who haven't. And anxiety, is a complex situation, which as you've correctly stated, stems from the brain. It's both peripheral in its physiological manifestations, in the sense of heavy breathing and breathing problems. But it's also psychological in the sense that one has feelings of tension and anxiety in the head. I can give you some interesting early results from our data, actually, which because we were able to, because we'd had so many people had taken part in our tests or had taken our tests prior to COVID-19, we were able to look at the profile of people now around the world versus back in 2017 was the last time we sort of took a snapshot. And one of the things that has really changed is the overall levels of anxiety in the general population. Now, perhaps that's not surprising to most people. We live in very complex and challenging times right now. But the fact that anxiety across the board has increased in 2020 from 2017 is one part of the puzzle. But the other part that's starting to tell us something a little bit more interesting about this disease is that this increase in anxiety is dependent on how serious one's COVID-19 symptoms were. So people who have had more serious symptoms, and this is according to their classification in the World Health Organization COVID-19 categorization, those people who have had more severe symptoms are those who are experiencing most anxiety. So this, is a suggestion that this is perhaps directly related to the disease. It's not maybe just having had the disease, but it's to do with the how badly the virus attacks the body. Again, we don't know all the answers, but it's an interesting early clue, I think, into the relationship between COVID-19 and anxiety.
It's a good start. Why does multitasking, like driving and talking at the same time, why does that cause symptoms like feeling faint or nauseous, or when multicasting, doing too many things at once, and then all of a sudden our brain just tells us it's too much? Why is that happening?
So now you're asking me a question that I do know something about, which is good. So multitasking is, I guess, a sort of a non-scientific word for what we know the brain is quite good at doing, and that is completing multiple tasks at once. Now, we generally, in our heads, we can't compartmentalize these. We very rarely are actually doing two things at once. We typically flip between different activities that we might have going on, and driving is a good example of this, where you've got to keep your eyes on the road. You might be trying to keep the kids quiet in the back. You might be trying to tune the radio. You've got to steer the car. You're doing all of these sort of different things. And as humans, we're very well adapted for doing these things because we have extremely nimble and flexible systems in our brain that can multitask. The problem is, when cognition breaks down, it's things like that become very difficult. And we've shown this in a number of different brain disorders in the past, that people's basic memory may still be fine. Their ability to speak and converse in conversation is fine. Their ability even to attend to a simple thing may be fine. But as soon as you try and combine those things, as soon as you try, say, driving, when you're trying to converse with your kids in the back seat, and you're trying to keep your eyes on the road, and you're trying to use your motor system to steer the car, things break down very quickly. It's that multitasking that's really difficult. And of course, that can be immensely stressful and immensely fatiguing, because it's hard to do when you're performing at suboptimal levels. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see this relationship between multitasking and things like fatigue and cognitive breakdown.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's talk about inflammation. Inflammation in the brain. Are we suffering from inflammation in our brains? And because we are having these concussive-like symptoms, nothing is showing up diagnostically. Are you seeing any kind of damage at a cellular level that's not showing up on the diagnostics? And can these symptoms, and will these symptoms, do you know, or have any feelings of how long we will be with them, or if they will resolve?
Just a full disclosure, this is not my area of expertise. I'm not an inflammation expert, and I can't really speak with authority to that question. I can give you some sort of very general ideas. The first is that I do a lot of brain imaging, and it isn't surprising to me that brain imaging studies may be returning negative results in lots of COVID-19 patients. And that doesn't mean that there aren't actually brain problems there. It means that the tools that we have are not sensitive enough to see the problems. If you take even patients with extremely severe brain injury, and by that I mean something like a loss of oxygen to the brain, often we'll put these patients into scanners, and it's very hard to see any substantial changes in the brain. And that doesn't mean they're not there. It means that our tools aren't good enough to detect them, because obviously, we know that they're there. So at the moment, I think most imaging methods, are not really, at least the brain changes that are associated with COVID-19 are possibly too subtle. And that's not to say they're not severe, but they're too subtle in how they would appear on brain imaging for us to detect with most brain imaging tools. And I think you suggested what's going on. You asked me what's going on at the cellular level, and I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not an expert in that area. But that's the sort of thing that people are looking at now to try to understand what's the real root cause of this brain problem. Sort of putting it simply, just because you have symptoms of a brain problem, and you may have very profound cognitive deficits, it doesn't mean when you go into a brain scanner you're going to be able to see them right there. Some problems are way more subtle than that. And again, that's not to suggest that they're not severe and they're not very apparent to the person who's suffering from them, but they are subtle in the sense that the changes in the brain are quite distributed, but small and difficult to detect.
Okay. Do you think that people who may have had pre-existing TBIs will have an amplified experience in their brain to COVID?
So we don't know the answer to that question. We will know, I think, a year from now, when we've been following these patients for all the patients that sign up to our study for a year. We may know the answer to that. Going back to the concussion question, we of course do know that multiple concussions are more than additive. You don't want to have more. I mean, you don't want to have any concussions, but you certainly don't want to have more than one concussion. So, if that is anything to go on, then yes, having had a previous TBI may put you in a more challenging position if you are to contract COVID-19. It's one of several what we call comorbidities, that could affect the outcome.
Okay, great. Now the next question is about the loss of taste and loss of smell that we are suffering. Would you be able to give us an idea if that's caused by injury to the brain?
Again, this is very interesting because people think. That's not a very fair answer. I think a lot of people tend to think, that smell is something that your nose does. Well, that's true at one level, but actually how we interpret and how we process smells is something that's very much a brain function. So yes, the fact that people are losing smell and taste is a clear and early indicator that this virus is having an effect on the brain. Now, it still doesn't tell us whether it's a direct effect on the brain or an indirect effect on the brain, but it is likely an effect on the brain nonetheless.
Would there be any difference if there's an indirect or direct on outcome of improvement?
It could be, and I think it's very important to understand the long-term, or for understanding the long-term trajectory of this virus, to understand whether this is a peripheral problem, an indirect effect on the brain, or whether it's a direct effect on the brain. I think most people listening to this will understand that if the virus is having a direct effect on the brain, then it's probably a little bit more worrying in the long term than if the effects are indirect. That said, indirect effects on the brain can be permanent. So it doesn't mean that if it's indirect, it isn't serious. So we need to understand what's going on here.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question about insomnia. A lot of people are experiencing interrupted sleep patterns, deprivation of sleep, and are wondering how can we improve this?
Well, again, unfortunately, it's too early to really to be able to answer that question in a fulsome way, I would say. And part of the reason for that is that we have a situation where the entire population is experiencing high levels of anxiety, whether or not you've had COVID-19 or not. And again, that's not in any sense to suggest that everybody has the same problems. Obviously, you're in a much worse position if you're COVID-19 positive. However, what we're trying to do is to unpack which of these things is directly related to the virus, because as I've said to you, we are seeing in the general population much higher levels of anxiety than we were pre-pandemic, and that's because many people are their jobs are on the line. Many people are worried about their futures. They may have problems with income. They may be isolated at home and be sort of deprived of their normal sort of levels of socialization. All of these things are going on, against this backdrop of COVID-19. So one of the things we're trying to work out in this study is what of all of these problems that people are reporting are actually related to the virus, and what are problems that the rest of us are also having because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And I'm not suggesting that is what's going on with sleeplessness, but it might be. We have no evidence. We don't know that the virus directly affects one's sleeping patterns. We do know that right now in the general population, we have heightened levels of anxiety, whether you're COVID positive or not. And we know that anxiety leads to sleep disturbance. So, you know, we got to get all the pieces together. It's very early days yet, but the answer is we don't know whether it's a direct relationship with the virus or not.
Right, fair enough. Okay, many of us are suffering from gastrointestinal issues. Could this be related? Symptoms like GERD? Does this be related to brain function at all?
Well, there's two ways of answering that question. Yes, it could, because you know how we digest food is also ultimately controlled by the brain, and disturbances of brain function can lead to disturbances of digestion. But of course, you know, this virus, as I've said previously, may attack many different organs in the brain, and it's entirely possible that there are, you know, direct effects on the digestive system. So yes, it could be a brain problem. It could be a non-brain problem. It could be even a non-COVID-19 problem, because again, things like anxiety, depression, can lead to or can be related to digestive problems, and you know these two things could well go hand in hand. So it's not necessarily the case that everybody that's having these problems is having them because of COVID-19 directly. It could be an indirect effect of the fact that we're in a pandemic. We're in a highly stressful situation right now.
Right. I know that myself, that symptom came on within the first few weeks of having the virus, when it came on early, and it's still stuck with me until today. I'm still having the GERD-like symptoms, and I'm on medication for it. But it came on very abruptly and very, very strongly. And it was really early on, and I didn't even realize that I had COVID at that time. So it was just bizarre how it just showed up one morning, full on.
Well, you're exactly the sort of person we need to sign up to our study, covidbrainstudy.com, because you know we have you, and you know I have that story, and that's a data point for us. What we really want is 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 data points, so that we can answer the questions that you personally have. I think this is one of these odd things about doing scientific research. I think a lot of people say, well, you know, I'm not going to do this because it's not going to be very helpful for me. I'm having these problems right now. And this isn't true in this case, because we know so little about this virus and the effects that it's having. And we're all having different experiences. And as I've said, it's against this background of an enormously stressful situation. We're all in the middle of a pandemic. We really need people to give us, 20 minutes of their time. Log on, tell us about their symptoms. Tell us what problems are you specifically having, and what neurological and cognitive problems are you having, and what were your experiences with the virus? How long did you have it for? Were you in hospital? Did you have medication? Were you ventilated? Were you even asymptomatic? Because right now there's a mass of data points out there in the world, and you're one of them. But the only way we can answer questions for everybody is if we can pull all that data together. And I promise it will be beneficial for every individual that is involved, because you will find out in an objective and a scientifically rigorous way how your symptoms and how the cognitive impairments that you are experiencing stack up against everybody else. And that's really important for understanding what's going on for each of us.
Absolutely. Joining the studies are the most important thing, and we really have to focus on getting everyone involved. That's very important. Just have a couple of questions left.
Okay.
Wanted to ask about delirium. Someone had a very high fever and was experiencing delirium and distortion of reality. It's caused by the fever, and could it be causing permanent brain damage?
So delirium is an extremely common problem for patients who spend any time in the intensive care unit, in the ICU. It's something that we see very often. There isn't a simple answer to this. I mean, the delirium could be, certainly let me back up. One, certainly can recover from delirium. Some patients go on to make a complete recovery, and for them it's a relatively transient thing. But it can also be symptomatic of a greater underlying problem. And so, it's very important to get this looked at and understood, because certainly many patients who experience delirium in the ICU go on to suffer long-term challenges related to that. As I say, it might be symptomatic of something else or a more serious underlying condition. So I think anybody who has symptoms of delirium, really needs to be looked at very closely by a medical professional.
Okay. Here's a question from Kevin, my friend, and we want to know, is consuming fat will help soothe and heal the brain? How involved is our diet in our healing experience with COVID?
I think I would be rather wary about offering anybody any dietary advice for dealing with COVID. Apart from the obvious things that one should follow if you're suffering from digestive problems related to having the disease, then one should take on lots of fluids and respond normally. I don't think there is any evidence, at least there's no evidence that I know of, that altering one's diet can make one either more resistant to or better able to overcome the effects of COVID-19. I mean, this is a really important issue for me as a scientist. I think we live in extremely challenging times right now, where many people doubt science. Many people think that they can Google the answers to things, and this is a huge challenge for us right now. All I can say is you have to stick to the scientific evidence. We do the best we can. We don't always know the answers to every question, but we can tell you when there is no scientific evidence to support something, or when the jury is still out, and we'll find out down the road. So I think people should be very wary. Obviously, everybody should eat well, eat healthily. That goes without saying, even when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. But I would be wary about anybody that said they had any dietary suggestion that could either make you less susceptible to COVID-19 or better able to combat it, because I don't believe the scientific evidence is there to support it.
Okay, so I think that wraps up the questions that I had for you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this little Q&A for us. I know that a lot of people will be very interested and happy that you took the time to do this for us. Is there anything in closing that you would like to tell us?
No, thanks very much for speaking to me. I mean, I've said it many times during the interview. If people will please sign up to covidbrainstudy.com. We really need your help. It's fun, and you'll find out a lot about your brain and about how your brain is performing relative to other individuals who are in the same situation as you. And most importantly, for me, you will help us to be able to better answer many of the questions that you've asked me today. As I've said many times, the jury is still out on a lot of these problems, and we need the public's assistance and help for us to be able to answer them as swiftly as we possibly can.
Agreed 100%. Thank you, Dr. Owen.
Thank you, my pleasure.